Continuing to work with pivot tables. Pivot tables are an invaluable tool in Excel because they give you a way to summarize data. However, they also give you a way to look at the exact data that you need. Let's face it, worksheets can contain tons of data. You may have a worksheet that contains a list of employees, the departments they work in, their job titles, the location they work, and their salary. And there may be 1,500 employees. By using a pivot table, you can easily view only the employees who work in the accounting department in your Denver, Colorado location, as an example. That said, there is so much to learn about pivot tables that we're going to continue to talk about them in this lesson. We're going to discover how to add multiple fields to columns and rows, work with grand totals and subtotals, adjust empty cells, create groups, use the classic way to create pivot tables, apply PivotTable styles, create custom styles and calculated fields, use the timeline filter option, filter data using the data slicer, and import data from an SQL server. In all the pivot table examples so far, we've only used one field per column or row. However, we can also add multiple fields to columns and rows. Here's our data. Now we're going to create a pivot table by going to the Insert tab, then clicking Pivot Table button. We're going to place our pivot table in a new worksheet. To start with, we're going to add the item field as a row in our pivot table. We're going to add the price each field into the values section. Now we want to add another field to our rows. We want to add the product ID. To do that, we're going to drag the product ID field to the row section and place it beneath the item, as you can see here. We also want to add the warehouse location of each item, so we're going to drag that to the row section as well. Have a look at our pivot table here. We now have the item as the heading for each row, then the product ID, and then the warehouse location for the subheadings. Now let's add another value. Let's add retail price. You can add as many additional fields as you want to your rows and columns. Grand totals are always displayed by default in Excel 2013. If you look at the bottom of the pivot table, you'll see the grand total. If you do not want the grand totals displayed, you can turn them off by going to the Analyze tab under the Pivot Table Tools section, and then click on Options. Click on the Totals and Filters tab. You can then uncheck Show Grand Total for rows and/or Show Grand Totals for columns. And then click OK. Subtotals are also automatically displayed in your pivot table. If you don't want subtotals to appear, right-click on the field label. In this example, we'll click on Basketball. Select Field Settings. As you can see, subtotals are turned on by default, which is automatic. Click on the None radio button and then click on OK. Of course, you can always choose to present the subtotals using a different function. You can choose Count, Average, Product, and so on, by putting a check beside the custom and then clicking OK. Of course, sometimes you may see empty cells appear in your pivot table. To do this, let's change an in-stock value for one of our items by deleting it. Now let's create a new pivot table and make sure we use that in-stock value. Drag the item to the rows, then drag the in-stock to the values section. We might need to refresh our data. Now you can see there's a blank value here next to Toy Fire Truck. You may wish to make it so that a 0 appears in these cells rather than having them appear blank. To do this, click anywhere in the pivot table and then right-click. Select Pivot Table Options and then go to the Layout and Format tab. Go to the Format section. Put a check mark besides for empty cells show, then enter a 0 into the box. Then click OK. As you can see, the 0 now appears in the empty cells. You can also group things together in your pivot table. Let's say in our pivot table we wanted to group together the board game and the cloth doll. We're going to select those. Now we're going to go to the Analyze tab and then click on Group Selection. You can now see group 1 in our pivot table here. If we compress the group, it will show us a subtotal. Take a look at our pivot table again. Notice that when we put the two items into a group, the rest of the items are listed as groups as well, even if none of them are grouped together. To rename a group, select the group, and then rename it in the formula bar. Let's look at another way to create pivot tables without having to drag different fields into different sections of the Pivot Tables Fields panel. Go to the Analyze tab and then click on Options. Click on the Display tab. Put a check mark beside Classic Pivot Table Layout, and then click OK. Now you can drag fields from the Pivot Table Fields panel right onto your pivot table. The Pivot Table Styles are found under the Design tab of the Pivot Table Tools. You can see this tab when you click anywhere inside your pivot table. A style will apply formatting to your pivot table. It can change the colour, font, and other attributes. The different pivot table styles are pictured in the ribbon here. You can click on this drop-down arrow here to show even more styles. You can simply mouse over any of these styles to see how it would look when applied to your table. Let's choose this style here. Based on the style that you choose, you may be able to turn row headers on or off by adding or removing the check mark in the ribbon. The same is true for column headers. We've chosen to turn ours off since they were on by default, so you can see the difference. You can also choose if you want banded rows, which changes the colour of every second row, or banded columns, which does the same thing for columns. In addition to applying a style, we can also choose the report layout. To do this, click on the Report Layout button under the Design tab. You can click on the different layouts to see how they affect your pivot table. By clicking the Subtotals button under the Design tab, we can choose if and how the subtotals are displayed. By clicking the Grand Totals button under the Design tab, we can choose our preference for how grand totals are displayed. By clicking on the blank row under the Design tab, we can insert blank rows to make our pivot tables easier to read. If you do not want to use a built-in pivot table style, you can create your own style using the tools provided in Excel 2013. To do this, go to the Pivot Table Styles in the Design tab. Select New Pivot Table Style from the drop-down menu. You'll then see the new Pivot Table Style dialog box. Start out by entering a name for the style. Now what you need to do is format each aspect of the pivot table. We're going to start with the first column. Click on the first column here. Now click the Format button. Under the Font tab, you can select your font type, style, and size. You can also choose your font color. Click the Border tab. Choose the border style that you want, as well as how and when the border appears. Next, click the Fill tab. Choose a fill color for the column. When you're finished, click on the OK button. This takes us back to the new Pivot Table Style dialog box. First column now appears in bold print to let us know that we've chosen formatting for it. Now let's click on the whole table and click on the Format button. Follow the same steps again. Repeat the steps until you have your new style created, and then click OK in the new Pivot Table Style dialog box. Your new style will then appear in the Pivot Table Styles box under the Design tab. Click on it to apply it to your pivot table. Calculations can be done within a pivot table without having access to the original data. Let's create a pivot table with just the items listed. In our pivot table, we have just our items listed. We haven't added any values to the table yet because we want to calculate the value of all the items in stock in our pivot table. To do this, we're going to add a calculated field. Go to the Analyze tab and click on Fields, Items and Sets in the Calculations group, and then select Calculated Fields. We then see the Insert Calculated Field dialog box. Enter in a name for this field. We're going to call it Stock Value. Next, create a formula for the field. Do so by clicking on the fields from the field list. We're going to select Price Each, and then click on Insert Field. Then we add the operator for multiply. Then we click on In Stock and insert that field. Now click OK. We can see that we now have a list of items as well as a stock value. We also have the timeline filter option. The timeline is new in Excel 2013. Whenever you have dates included in your original data, you can use the timeline to help further sort your data without adding those dates to your pivot table. Let's show you what we mean. Let's create a new pivot table with just the items and the number of in stock. The items go in the rows and in stock goes in the values. We also want to change this to be the sum of in stock, not the count. We also want to restore the original toy fire truck value before we changed it. Now we can refresh our data. Now we're ready to go. We have our items and we have the quantity that we have in stock. We want to find out the dates on which we received each item. We don't have this information as a row or a column in our pivot table, but it's in our original data from which we created the pivot table. To view the timeline and be able to filter by the dates, we're going to click in our pivot table and then go to the Analyze tab. Now click on Insert Timeline. If you don't have any dates in your original data, this is the error message that you'll receive. So let's go back to our pivot table data and we can see that I've just added the date received column in here. So let's create a new pivot table with this new data. We want to add in our item and our in-stock value. Now click on Insert Timeline again. As you can see, we only have one field in our original data that contains dates. So we put a check mark beside it and then click OK. We can now see our timeline. It's shown as a floating window in our worksheet. Next, click on a month in the timeline or select multiple months to filter the data. The data slicer provides another way to filter your data in your pivot table. The slicer allows you to choose any fields in your data, then use that as a filter in the pivot table. You can use any of the fields in your original data to filter the data in your pivot table. To add a slicer to a pivot table, click inside your pivot table, then click Insert Slider under the Analyze tab. Put a check mark beside the fields you want to use to filter the pivot table and for which you want the slicers created, and then click OK. Let's choose Retail Price. Once the slicers are created, filter the data by selecting the items you want to display in each slicer by clicking them. We now see our filtered results in the pivot table. So far, we've used pivot tables that use data from the same workbook. We can also create a pivot table from an external database, such as an SQL server. To do this, we're going to create a blank worksheet by clicking on the plus sign here, then go to the Data tab. Click the From Other Sources button, and then select From SQL Server. You'll then see the Data Connection wizard. Enter your information to connect to your SQL server. To do this, you'll need a server to connect, whether it's your own computer or an actual server that you're using. Once you do that, click on Next. In the Next window, you'll see a list of the data available on the server. Select the data that you want to use and then click Next. After that, you'll get to see the final window. In this window, Excel will give your data a file name. This is because Excel will save the connection if you want to use it again in the future. Click Finish. You'll then see the Import Data dialog box. In the Select how you want to use this data in your workbook section, choose the Pivot Table report. Choose if you want to place it in an existing worksheet or a new worksheet. Now you'll see your fields in the Pivot Table Fields panel on the right side of your Excel window. You can see that my file here is blank because I haven't actually connected to an SQL server. But if you have, you can follow the same steps that you learned earlier in this course to create a pivot table. However, instead of using data from the workbook, it will use the data you've imported from your SQL server.